This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial advice. I am not a licensed financial advisor. Always do your own research and consult a qualified professional before making any financial decisions. The stock market has delivered average annual returns of roughly 10% for nearly a century. Most people know this. Most people aren't invested. Not because they don't have access. Not because they can't afford it. Because of something happening inside their heads that nobody has ever asked them to examine. Today, we're going to name it. Because the distance between knowing you should invest and actually doing it isn't a knowledge gap. It's a psychological one. And it's costing people more than they realize. Participation rates in equity markets remain surprisingly low across income groups. Studies consistently show that a significant portion of households hold no stocks at all, not even through employer retirement plans. Among those who do invest, median account balances remain far below what long-term compounding would require. This is not a knowledge problem. Most people understand, at least abstractly, that investing grows wealth over time. They've heard it. They've nodded along. But there is a significant gap between knowing and doing. And in that gap lives a collection of psychological barriers that financial education almost never addresses. We're going to name 3 of them today. Because once you see what's actually stopping you, the solution becomes far more actionable than just invest. The most foundational barrier to investing is loss aversion, the same force we've discussed in other contexts on this channel. Kahneman and Tversky established that losses feel roughly twice as painful as equivalent gains feel rewarding. The prospect of losing $1,000 registers more intensely than the prospect of gaining $1,000. In the context of investing, this creates a significant problem. You might intellectually understand that a diversified portfolio tends to produce positive returns over long periods. But emotionally, your brain weighs the possibility of a 20% drop far more heavily than a 20% gain. The fear is disproportionate to the statistical reality. This produces what researchers call myopic loss aversion, the tendency to evaluate investments over very short time horizons, making natural market volatility feel unbearable. Even people who know that markets recover over time feel genuine distress during downturns. That distress triggers an impulse to exit, and exiting during downturns is one of the most costly financial decisions an investor can make. For people who haven't started investing, this fear operates even earlier. The possibility of bad timing stops the whole process. What if the market crashes right after I put money in? This specific fear is one of the most commonly cited reasons for not starting. Statistically, it almost never reflects reality. But emotionally, it is very real. Beyond loss aversion, a second force operates: ambiguity aversion. Humans don't just dislike losing, they specifically dislike uncertainty about outcomes. In 1961, economist Daniel Ellsberg demonstrated in what became known as the Ellsberg paradox that people consistently prefer known risks over unknown ones, even when the unknown option is statistically superior. Investing feels ambiguous. You don't know which assets will perform. You don't know when markets will rise or fall. You don't know if you're making a smart choice or a costly one. And that uncertainty is deeply uncomfortable, more uncomfortable than the abstract knowledge that markets have historically trended upward. So people gravitate toward what feels knowable: a savings account with a predictable interest rate, even a low one; property they can see and touch; cash in an account they can check any time. These preferences aren't irrational in isolation, but in aggregate, they produce enormous opportunity cost. The gap between a 3% savings account return and a 10% market return, compounded over 30 years on a meaningful sum, is not a small number. The comfort of certainty has a price. Most people never calculate it. Ambiguity aversion is also why so many people who do start investing freeze at the point of selecting investments. The fear of picking wrong, of choosing the bad stock, the wrong fund, creates paralysis that keeps them in cash indefinitely. Not investing is uncomfortable, but picking wrong feels worse. There is a third barrier that almost never gets discussed in mainstream financial content, and it may be the most powerful of the three: identity. For many people, particularly those from lower income backgrounds or who didn't grow up in households that talked about money, the stock market doesn't feel like a place that belongs to them. It feels like something wealthy people do, sophisticated people, people who already understand things they don't. This isn't irrational. For much of financial history, stock market participation was genuinely restricted by minimums, access, and systems not designed for broad inclusion. That legacy shapes cultural attitudes even after the access barriers have largely been removed. If investing doesn't feel like something that people like you do, if it conflicts with your self-concept, you won't do it, regardless of whether it makes financial sense. Identity is a more powerful driver of behavior than information. Always. This also explains why certain financial content does harm, even when it's technically accurate. Presenting investing as complex, exclusive, or dependent on expertise reinforces the barrier it claims to address. It signals, this is for someone who already knows more than you do. Here's what the research supports. 1. Start before you feel ready. The most common form of investment paralysis is waiting until you understand it well enough to feel confident. That moment rarely comes, and every month of waiting has a compounding cost. Open a retirement or brokerage account today, even if you fund it minimally. The act of starting changes your identity relationship with investing. You become someone who invests. That matters. 2. Use index funds and eliminate selection anxiety. Ambiguity aversion feeds on the fear of picking wrong. You don't have to pick. A low-cost index fund that tracks the total market removes the selection decision entirely. You're not betting on individual companies. You're betting on the economy as a whole, which has a stronger historical track record than virtually any active strategy. 3. Automate contributions. The worst time to decide how much to invest is when you receive a paycheck and competing expenses feel urgent. Set a recurring transfer that happens on a fixed schedule. Remove the decision from the moment. What's automated doesn't require bandwidth, willpower, or a good mood. 4. Zoom out your time horizon. Myopic loss aversion is driven by short-interval evaluation. If you check your portfolio daily, the natural volatility of markets will generate emotional distress that has no bearing on your actual financial trajectory. Quarterly check-ins are sufficient for a long-term portfolio. Let compounding work without the interference of emotional reactions to short-term fluctuations. Most people never invest not because they lack access or information. They don't invest because their brain has constructed a very convincing set of reasons to wait. The fear of losing, the discomfort of uncertainty, the feeling that it isn't for them. These are real psychological forces. They're not character flaws. They're predictable outputs of a brain that evolved for very different circumstances than global capital markets. But because they're predictable, they can be accounted for. You can build systems that make investing automatic before the fear kicks in. You can choose instruments that eliminate the selection anxiety. You can zoom out your time horizon so that short-term volatility stops feeling like a verdict. The market doesn't care about your timing anxiety. Over decades, the direction of growth has been consistent enough that the primary predictor of investment success isn't intelligence, timing, or picking the right stocks. It's starting, and not stopping. Every year you don't invest, the compounding clock isn't running. That cost is invisible today and enormous in the future. If this helped you see your own hesitation more clearly, subscribe to Broke Thinking. Every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, we publish videos breaking down the psychology behind money decisions, so you can start making better ones. We'll see you next time.